I'm starting this out a bit different than I thought I would. When Rivka asked me to do this presentation on Minuchin, I said that's fine. And she asked me what... I had to give her a blurb about it, and the first thing that came to my mind was the world's greatest living family therapist. And last week, for everybody who doesn't know, Salvador Minuchin passed away. In Florida, he was 96. And I think especially for me, since I've been thinking about him a lot in preparation of this, it sort of struck me pretty deeply. Salvador Minuchin was really the last of the great American founders of family therapy, and was probably the family therapist that influenced the development of family therapy more than anyone else. He had a very special relationship with Israel, which I will also talk about. What made Minuchin very special was, on the one hand, he was a tremendously charismatic therapist, the kind that when you see his work, first thing you think is that I could never do anything like that. On the other hand, of all the founding fathers and mothers, he had a Torah that was clear, and he was really the family therapist that could give more than anyone else tools to make a map of the family and tools to make a map of the intervention. So I think, when we think about his work, we should think that basically what Salvador Minuchin can do in 5 minutes, maybe we can do in 5 sessions, and then we can use what he has to give us. So what I'm planning to do today is I want to give a short biography of Minuchin. Then we'll talk a bit about Minuchin's understanding of the family, the therapeutic process, therapeutic techniques, and I'm hoping that at the end, we will have time to look at about half an hour of Minuchin working himself. Right. Okay. Minuchin was born in Argentina in 1921. He liked to say that he was born in a Argentinian shtetl. His parents were immigrants from Russia, and he really lived in a little town where most of the people were Jewish, and where everybody knew everybody else.
Was he Jewish?
Yes, he was Jewish. He was very, very Jewish. Salvador Minuchin. He grew up in a family where roles were very well defined traditionally, and also in an environment where there was a very cohesive Jewish community with a hostile non-Jewish community around, or at least that's how he certainly perceived it. As many young Argentinians, he was very active politically at a very early age. He was jailed for a time during the Perón era, but it did not get in the way of him finishing his medical school. He was graduated in 1946, and in 1948 he came to Palestine, to Israel, and he joined the Palmach, and he fought in the War of Independence. In 1950, he went to America, where he did his psychiatric work, and he became a psychiatrist. And in 1951, he made Aliyah. And he lived in Israel for the next 3 years, and he worked primarily with Aliyat Noar, which was the organization that was taking in all the children that didn't have parents, did not have a place to be, and he worked in their institutions. And then 3 years later, he went back to America to do his psychoanalytic training, which a lot of people were surprised to hear that he did psychoanalytic training. But he also did it at the White Institute, which in a way was an institute that was a bit ahead of its time in that it had a much more relational approach as opposed to the ego psychology orientation of psychoanalysis at the time in the United States. And while he was doing this, he worked at the Wiltwick School for Boys, which is a school for boys who had been taken out of their homes, and put in an institution. And he started some of the first experiments in working with families of these either delinquents or boys who had been taken out for other reasons, under the idea that if they're going to go back to their environment, something needs to change in order for them to move forward. And then both with his work in Aliyat Nor and also at Wiltwick, I think it's very important understanding him because he worked with the more people who are in a lower socioeconomic strata, as opposed to most of the other people who were working in family therapy at the time, who worked with more middle-class families. In 1962, he made what was known as the Hajj to Mecca in Palo Alto, where in California, where a lot of the first pioneering work in family therapy was being done, and there he met Jay Haley, and who was there at the time, and the two of them each started their own branch of family therapy afterwards. Minuchin was in Philadelphia, and Haley was in Washington. And in 1965, he became the head of the Philadelphia Child Guidance Clinic, and that's where he really did the fundamental work of putting together his theory of structural family therapy. There was also in the Child Guidance Clinic, there was also a population. It was a very mixed population, and his model of work was, to a certain extent, very much aimed at helping families that were more multi-problem. What I forgot to say is that his first major work came out in 1967, which was about his work at Wiltwick with the boys and their families, and that's called Families of the Slums. And from his work at Philadelphia came out his first major work on family therapy, which was Families and Family Therapy, that came out in, I think, 75. So in the 70s, he was part of the whole family therapy sort of roadshow. In that time, the major family therapists, whether it was Minuchin or Virginia Satir, Jay Haley, Chloe Madonis, they would go from city to city. They would have these huge sort of family therapy shows. They'd be, and he got to know, and people got to know about family therapy. There was a lot of flack from the psychological and therapy establishment at the time. But those were the years when family therapy was established. And those were the years when Minuchin also had a big influence here in Israel about the development of family therapy, because his mother and his sister lived here. So he would come to visit them every once in a while, and while he would come, he would share with people here what he was doing. In 1976, he stepped down as the director of the guidance clinic, and he left in 1981, and he started his own institute in New York, from which he retired in 1996. But he continued working. The film that I'll be showing to you was done here in Israel in the year 2007. And he made another visit to Israel a few years later. So until he was about 90, he was very active. Okay. So, what is structural family therapy? This is a quote from Minuchin, and I find it very helpful. And probably not the first time I read it when I go back to it. it explains again and again and again how this theory works. He called it a body of theory and technique, which relates to the individual in his social context and is aimed at changing the organization of the family. When the structure of the family changes, the experience of the individual in the family changes. The therapist joins the family with the aim of changing the organization of the family, such as the experiences of the family members change. Okay? So that, taking that even into one sentence, basically we're talking about how to influence the family and the way it's organized so that people in the family will have a different experience. Okay. Now, so I said I wanted to talk about how Minuchin looked at the family. First of all, he said, what are the functions of the family? Why does this organization exist? And he talked about three basic functions of the family, which I don't think will be foreign to people who are listening to this now. He would talk about the psychosocial, first of all, the psychosocial defense of its members. And the idea that the outside environment can be dangerous to people, can be hurtful to people, and they need the family to protect them. The outside environment can be invasive in a harmful way. So if we would take the example of, let's say, a child who's been attacked outside the family, the child definitely needs the family to respond to that. And there will be various degrees in how the family does respond to that. In the sense there will be the child that will be ignored, or the child that won't even know that he or she needs to tell their parents about it. There will be the child that will be able to tell the parents, and the parents will take appropriate action. There will also be the child that tells the parents, and the parents make such an extreme reaction to it that they're not really being helpful to their child. So that's the kind of thing that Minuchin would be looking at. How is the family protecting its members from the outside? At the same time, the family needs to help its members adjust to the outside. If we think about that same child, maybe not who was attacked, but who was going to the school for the first time, how is the family managing that process of helping the child adjust to the environment outside of the school? His third function, what he calls the provision of a sense of identity, I think it's interesting because the whole question of how identity or how self is developed changes from theory to theory. And Minuchin really talked about three aspects of identity. One is the aspect of belonging, in the sense that the child adjusts to the family's way of life. In that sense can say, I am a member of the Cohen family, because the Cohens do things like this and this and this. But identity is also, an important part of identity is also separateness, which means that the child learns, first of all, within the family, that there are different parts of the family, and that not everybody is the same. The parents and the children are different. The boys and the girls are different. The smart people in the family and the not so smart people in the family are different. So there are different subgroups within the family that the child learns who he or she is part of and who they are not like. And he also talked about autonomy, and there he was talking about how the family is adjusting itself to the needs of a particular child. And so the child will feel that he's being related to in a way that is appropriate to him or her. Okay. Now there are three basic constructs in Minuchin's theory. He talks about structure, he talks about subsystems, and he talks about boundaries. We'll start with family structure. The family structure is a set of functional demands organized into patterns which govern family members' interaction. So what are the rules by which the members of the family know that they have to behave? As these transactions are repeated over time, they foster expectations, so that over time people know how they're going to behave and they know how other people in the family are going to behave. And once these patterns are established, family members only use a fraction of the full range of behavior available to them. And that's a very important point here. Because according to Minuchin's whole theory is based on the idea that if we can rearrange the organization, the family in a better way, people's latent potential will come to the fore. In a sense, Minuchin doesn't think that he's really creating new patterns in the family. He thinks that he is enabling the family to expand its range of already potential ways of relating. So that, and so, for example, the first time a baby cries in the middle of the night, no one knows what's going to happen. Are the parents going to wake up? Is the mother going to get up? Is the father going to get up? Are they both going to get up? Are they going to fight about who's getting up? Nobody knows. But something happens. Now, the next time that happens, the baby wakes up in the middle of the night, there's already a possible way of relating to this. Now, it might not be the same. The second time around, it might be completely different. But over time, the parents start to relate in a certain way to that. Now, in one way, that's good, because if they're going to have to figure out every time the baby wakes up what they're going to do, they're going to have a problem. On the other hand, it may not be the best way. But according to Minuchin, because this is the way that it's been done, so that's the way people usually continue, until something difficult enough happens for someone to try to make a change. I think Minuchin and all the people of that period, both people in Palo Alto, J. Haley, and Minuchin, they were very much caught up with the idea of homeostasis, which means that things stay the same unless something really big happens to change them. So I thought I would give just an example from my own family experience about how this kind of thing works. So in the family that I grew up in, one of there was a clear rule that unless something really difficult happened, you went to school in the morning. There's none of this Yom Shel Pinuk, a day of just a day off from school because you feel like it. This is not how things worked in my family. And as I was growing up, I didn't really think much about it because that's just the way it was. I do remember that when my cousin Charlie had his bar mitzvah, I live in Cincinnati, my cousin lived in Detroit, and we went to the bar mitzvah, and so we went to bar mitzvah on Saturday, of course, and then Sunday was the big party, but we couldn't stay because I had to get back to school if we stayed, and I remembered that. And then when I was about 16 or 17, I was looking for ways to see how I can bend some of these rules, and I went away that we had a seminar in another city, and I was telling my friends how I was just going to stay for another couple days, and I would just do that, and they were all very impressed. But I called my parents to tell them, which says something, and I could have not called them, and my father said, "You're coming right home," and I said, "Okay." And so that rule was still going. Now, at that same time, I did find ways to get in trouble which were much worse than not going to school one day, but so there's a question whether that was functional or not, but that's what happened. And then when I had kids who went to school, first of all, it was sort of easy because Like my oldest, he always wanted to get to school early because that's when the inyanim happened. That's when the important things were going on, and he was very influential on his younger brothers, and so they did that as well. But then the youngest, when he was about 16, he started not getting up to go to school. And so my first reaction was, no, you're going to school. And then I would come home and I find out that didn't work anymore. He didn't go to school. And this happened a few times, and there was a little tension there. And then at one point I said to myself, well, I guess that's changed. And there's a question whether that was for the better or for the worse, but that's sort of how it went with that rule. I mean, actually afterwards I found out from my older brother that he did leave for school every day in high school, but he often didn't get there, but that was something else. So these are the kind of things that Minuchin looks at, like how does a family operate around all different situations like that. The structure, where are we here? Oh, we're not there yet. So a structure may be beneficial to the family, or it may add to the difficulties. Whatever the chosen pattern, it tends to be self-perpetuating and difficult to change. And although alternatives are available, families are unlikely to consider them unless changing circumstances produce stress and dysfunction in the system. Now, when I first learned family therapy, my first teacher in family therapy was a psychiatrist originally from South Africa, named Valerie Velds. And I remember she would always say in the family sessions to people, her line that she repeated all the time was, find another way. She didn't tell them what to do, but she had the idea that each person has potential to try something else if they're pushed hard enough. Okay, so that is structure. As far as family subsystems, this is also an important idea for Minuchin because he very much looked what are the systems within the family system. Because the family, and not everybody can do everything within the family. Not everybody can be washing the dishes after dinner. Not everybody can be, if someone gets hurt, not everybody can be running to that person and helping them out. The family needs to have some kind of differentiation of function. And that's according to the different groupings within the family. Of course, also their parents and the children. The groupings can be according to generation, they can be according to gender, they can be according to interest or function. And there are obvious groupings, such as parents and children, but there are also groupings within the family that are sometimes more subtle, in the sense that it could be mom and the kids against dad, or mom and some of the kids against some dad and some of the other kids. It could be within the sibling subsystem. So a sibling subsystem can be a system of support. It could also be a system where there's a lot of tension and conflict. Now, another part of this is that people within a family are in various subsystems. For example, a woman can be a wife, a mother, a daughter, a niece, and if she is flexible, then she will know that within each different subsystems, she needs to adjust her behavior accordingly. But if she doesn't know that, then she might be in trouble, because it could be appropriate for her to scold her child, but if she scolds her parents, that might have a different effect. Okay. The same thing, a parental child. It may be appropriate for that child to be in charge when the parents aren't around, but if that child is still in charge when the parents are back, that might be a bit of a problem. Okay. Now, the third major piece of all of this picture is the whole subject of boundaries. Now, I really like what Minuchin, what he has to say about boundaries, because I think that's a word that we use a lot. We don't always really think about so much what we're talking about when we say, when we're talking about boundaries. We'll say, this family doesn't have boundaries, but what does that exactly mean? So he divides it up this way. So first of all, it's the boundaries are rules defining who participates and how in terms of three different categories. One is knowledge, one is action, and one is emotional reverberation. So what does that mean? We talk about boundaries that deal with knowledge. That's simply who knows what about whom. What is considered private in a family, and what is considered information that everybody has a right to know. So for example, let's say the oldest girl in the family, for the first time, gets her period. What's going to happen with that information? Is it just going to stay with her? She's not going to say anything? Is she going to tell her mother? And if she tells her mother, where's the information going from there? Is everybody going to know? Or is it going to stay within the women in the family? These are all sort of questions about where the boundary goes around information about those kind of subjects in the family. And there's a big question, the differentiation of what kind of family members know what kind of information. How much do the children know about what's going on between the parents? Should they know a lot? Should they know a little bit? These are all ways of looking at how information flows within the family. The second category is action. And that is really the question of, to what extent are functions assigned within the family? How much do people know what they're going to do? I mean, Minuchin grew up in a family where people knew very well what their roles were. And he was working in a society where that was changing. And I think he saw a lot of confusion that people had about what their roles were in the family. To what extent can family members allow one another to perform tasks without joining in? I think that's a big thing in Jewish families, actually. What role do age and gender play in that question of who does what? And the third aspect of boundaries is emotional reverberation. To what extent are family members affected emotionally by the emotional states of each other? If one family member is feeling sad, does that sadness stay with him or her, or does it spread throughout the family? One woman reported that as a child she was upset about something and started to cry, and her parents would laugh and tell her to go water the plants. So within that family, it was as if her feelings stayed just with her. As opposed to another woman who said, if I was feeling sad, I couldn't tell my mother because she would be so sad that I would have to take care of her. So in that family, the boundaries were very, very loose and diffuse around emotions. And of course, there are also families with, yes, yeah.
Did Minuchin provide operational definitions for what's healthy and what's not?
And not so much. Okay, the question was, thank you, did he provide, would you say?
Operational definitions.
Operational definitions for what was healthy and what was not? In principle, no. Because he would basically say, we need to see how this family is functioning. I think that came very much from his work in the slums, because there were a lot of families there that were multi-problem, that were grandparents were taking care of the kids, or that there was a single mother, and there were parental children very much involved. And so he didn't look at that a priori as pathological. He said, is this working, or is it not working? Is it working? What are the prices that are being paid for that? And if it was working, then it's good. And if it's not working, then we have to look around and find some way of organizing the family. The function of the boundaries is to protect the differentiation of the system. And the quality of the boundaries, or the level of clarity, affects the functioning. And he talked about two sort of basic groups of boundaries. One are diffuse or enmeshed, and one are rigid or disengaged. And enmeshed systems offer a heightened sense of mutual support, but at the expense of independence and autonomy. Like sometimes you'll find, for example, in a family with a family business, that everybody's in the business, everybody knows what their place is, but if someone doesn't want to be in the business, they might have a problem because they're trying to be different. Children growing up in enmeshed families will tend to feel loved, but may have problems functioning independently or dealing with people outside the family. As opposed to boundaries that are rigid, or families with rigid boundaries, they are usually overly restrictive and permit little contact with outside systems, and that results in disengagement, but this can lead either to isolation or to independence. And again, he's not saying enmeshed is bad, enmeshed is good, rigid is bad, rigid is good. He's saying it's a way of looking at the boundaries and to help us think, how is this family operating, and where is it operating well and where is it not? I have here. Okay, one thing that I added here for you, not for me, was that boundaries can be complex. And we need to know that, for example, the boundaries within the family can be very, very diffuse, but between the family and the outside world, they can be very, very rigid, for example. Okay. Another aspect of all of this, as far as boundaries and subsystems, has to do with hierarchy. The way leadership is organized within the family. Or in short, who can tell what to do. And this is an especially important concept when we think about the relationships between parents and children. I think that Minuchin grew up in an era where he probably would think that parents too much told the children what to do, and as he worked, he saw that the problem was starting to change, and there were parents who didn't tell their children enough what to do. Okay. So how does he see the normal family process? First of all, he talks about the myth of a happy, harmonious family. He said that is a myth. That's not what families are about. Families are constantly struggling with the problems of living. And our role as therapists is not to try to make everything happy and harmonious. What distinguishes a normal family is not the absence of problems, but a functional structure for dealing with them. And the family is transformed over time, and this is also very important. That the structure in one stage of family development may be very good, but it might not be so good for the next stage in family development. And the family is always in a process of either changing or adjusting to change, or being a kind of period before the next change. And I think these are things that we all know. That when two people marry, the structural requirements for the new union are accommodation and boundary making. And people have to get used to each other, and they need to make new boundaries around the couple. Couples need to make when they have children, the whole structure of the family changes. Children need different structures as they go through different stages of their development. So the strength of the system depends on its ability to mobilize alternative transactional patterns when internal or external conditions of the family demand its restructuring. The first time a child goes to school, the family needs to restructure. Some families go through that pretty smoothly. Some families have a big problem with that. And it doesn't mean that there's something inherently pathological about the family. It means that it could mean that, but it could also mean that this family has not been able to make the adjustment that it needed to make. So in a sort of healthy family process, the family adapts to stress in a way which maintains family continuity while making restructuring possible. And he warns family therapists not to mistake growing pains for pathology. Healthy families more easily modify their structure to accommodate to changed circumstances, and dysfunctional families tend to increase the rigidity of structures that are no longer effective. And that's something that both Minuchin and all the people of his time were really looking at, is how families, when they're having a problem, and they use their old ways of dealing with it, and it doesn't work, so they just use it more. And well, actually, when we take a look at the work that I'm going to show you, he really brings a family like that have gotten caught up in doing the same thing that they know how to do, but it doesn't work. Okay, so how do problems start? Behavior disorders arise when inflexible family structures cannot adjust adequately to maturational or situational challenges. The family dysfunction results from a combination of stress and failure to realign themselves to cope with it. And it could be inherent in their inherent flaws in the family structure, or this just could be the family's difficulty of getting to a new stage. In more disengaged families, the boundaries are rigid, emotional distance is excessive, and the family fails to mobilize support when it's needed. In enmeshed families, boundaries are diffuse and family members overreact and become intrusively involved with one another. Okay. Now, the most common expression of fear of change is conflict avoidance, and I also really like the way he looks at conflict avoidance. Because what does he say? Conflict avoidance is the failure to recognize conflict and to deal with it directly. Now, disengaged families avert conflict by avoiding contact. They don't have to come into contact with each other, and it's as if the conflict is not there. And in enmeshed families, they avoid conflict or either by denying differences or by constant bickering, which means they're always talking about it, and which allows them to sort of vent their feelings without pressing each other for change or for resolving the conflict. And we also know many situations like that people have been fighting about the same thing for 20 years. Now, Minuchin, he took all of these ideas, and what he loved to do with it, he liked to make maps. He liked to map out the family, so the therapist will have a kind of map or diagnosis of what's going on. And I gave you some of the symbols that he uses there. There's the straight line for the rigid boundary. There's the sort of, what's that called? Mikuvkav, how do you say it in English? Whatever. That you see it, the clear boundary. And the boundary with dots is the diffuse. There's the coalition, conflict, detouring, involvement, and over-involvement. So that's just so you can have them. So, for example, a common expression of conflict avoidance between partners involves diverting attention to the children. We all know about that. In which case, conflicts between spouses are played out in the parenting battlefield. So, number one way of doing that is what he called scapegoating. And this is a situation, you see the diagram, where there's a conflict between the parents, which is not expressed, and they are both overly focused on their child. And so instead of worrying about themselves, instead of dealing with their own problem, they are overly dealing with their child. Recently I had a family in therapy, or a couple in therapy. They were people more about my age who they had a son who is not doing anything with himself. And I think he did have problems, but they spent all the time in therapy just talking about him. and if anything came a little close to what's going on between them, the husband made it very, very clear that he didn't want to talk about that. Eventually, it became clear that there were so many things going on between them that we really had to address that. The son at the same time was telling them, you really don't have to be so involved with me, and they were able to start the process of dealing with what was going on between them. But when they first came to therapy, they were coming because of their son. Now, another way of using the children to avoid conflict is to argue through the children, which means father wants to deal with the children in one way and mother wants to deal with the children in another way. So the classic pattern there is that the father says that the mother is too permissive, the mother says that the father is too strict, the father may withdraw, causing mother to criticize his lack of concern, which causes further withdrawal, and eventually you have a situation that starts out as mother and father in conflict, but eventually comes mother and the children in a coalition against the father. Okay. Now, some families function well when the children are small, but the parents have difficulty dealing with discipline and control on the one hand, as well as the independence needs of the children as they grow older. So that family could be like the diagram above, where the mother and the father and the children are sort of enmeshed together, but things are actually going pretty well. But then the child has to go to school, and the child doesn't want to go to school. The child doesn't want to go to school because the system hasn't really adjusted to the fact that the child needs to go to school. It could be that the parents like having the child at home. It could be the parents are having trouble seeing the child as more independent. And the child is also used to being in this kind of environment. Minuchin worked a lot with blended families. And blended families go through they go through changes that sort of like all along the way, there's sort of the potential for difficulties in the transition. So if we think about families where the parents have separated and divorced and the parents are remarried, so you start out in a situation where there's a conflict between the parents and the children are there. And then there comes a situation where the parents have separated and they still have their relationship with their children. And then at some point, for example, in this family, the mother has remarried, there's a stepfather, they're living with the children, and the father is trying to maintain his relationship with his children. Now, every step of the way, there's potential for things going wrong. There's also potential for things going right. But they just, for example, the one possibility of things going wrong would be that if the mother and children insist on doing things that they always have, and maybe the stepfather insists on doing things how he thinks they should be done, that could develop into a situation where the mother and children are very close and there's a kind of barrier between them and the stepfather, which, if things really go wrong, could develop into a situation of abuse. But that's one of the possibilities. Another, yes.
Why would it develop into abuse?
Because, thank you. The question was asked, why would it develop into abuse? Because the stepfather is feeling so isolated and so angry, and feel he doesn't have a way of getting in there, that he might go in there with a kind of aggression that could develop into abuse. And the mother could be thinking all along how she has to protect herself from her new husband, and has to protect her children. That can develop in that kind of direction. Okay. So understanding complexity. An important aspect of the structural family problems is that symptoms in one member reflect not only that person's relationships with others, but also the fact that those relationships are a function of still other relationships in the family. For example, if this teenager, it's the son, is feeling depressed, so it's important to know that he has a kind of enmeshed relationship with his mother, that she doesn't really allow him so much the kind of independence that he needs. But that's only a partial view of the system. The question is, why is the mother enmeshed with her son? Could it be that she is having problems adjusting or making ties with the world outside the family? Is there contact with the husband? Is the husband over involved in his work outside? So knowing this whole picture gives us a kind of broader map of the family, and also gives us a sort of food for thought about where we want to intervene. Should we be intervening between the mother and the son, or should we be helping the mother sort of find herself, or should we be helping the couple with their relationship? Okay, so let's talk about the goals of therapy. Therapy is directed at altering family structure, so that the family can solve its problems. And so the goal of the therapy is structural change and not problem solution. Minuchin is very clear about that. He said you can solve problems, but if you don't get to the structure, then something else will just come up. And I said before, therapists see their job as activating latent structures. And so like helping the family develop its potential. The therapist joins the family systems to help its members change their structure. In a sense, Minuchin talks about creating a therapeutic system in which the therapist and the family are members of that system. The goal, by altering boundaries and realigning subsystems, the therapist changes the behavior and the experience of each family member. The goal is to facilitate the growth of the system, to resolve symptoms, and encourage growth in individuals, while also preserving the mutual support of the family. Without structural change, short-term symptom resolution may collapse. And most important for the general goals of family is the creation of an effective hierarchical structure. With enmeshed families, the goal is to differentiate individuals and subsystems by strengthening the boundaries around them. And with disengaged families, the goal is to increase interaction by making boundaries more permeable. Now, so how does the therapist do this? So the therapist's function is to facilitate the transformation of the therapeutic process. And he does this in 3 steps. He first joins the system in a position of leadership. And the position of leadership is very important here. The therapist in structural family therapy is very central. It is saying from the outlet, more or less, like I'm going to be at the top of the structure here, more or less, and then we'll see what happens. From that position of joining, he diagnoses the structure, and then he creates circumstances that will allow the transformation of the structure. As a result of the change of structure, the individual's experience changes. The therapist assumes responsibility for attaining goals. And the reliance of the family on the therapist is important because of the anxiety generated by the change of the structure. And this is also a very important part. And this is important, I think, in therapy in general. But the therapist is coming in and he's basically saying to the family, what you're doing is wrong. But he needs to be connected with them enough, first of all, that they're going to be willing to listen to that. And that they need to trust him enough so that they will be willing to try to change. Okay. So we talk about joining. There are basically two general goals of joining. One is to gather information about the family system and to create a relationship with the family that will serve as a basis of change. Now, as far as its characteristics of joining, yes. Joining is a disturbance of the normal process of the family. I think we all know that. If we're home with our family and someone comes to visit, things change. It's not the same situation. I think another example of that is how when a couple goes out to dinner with another couple, they find themselves talking about all sorts of things about themselves that they didn't talk about at home because there's something different about that situation. So the introduction to the therapist, it changes what's going on. And the therapist is going to want to notice how is his entrance into the family, how is it being received? There's some families that just bring the therapist in. You feel that there's no problem in that first session. Everybody wants to talk to you, everybody wants to make room for you. There are other families, you come into the family and it's very hard to get a word out of anybody, and you get this feeling that the family so much doesn't want to be there, or doesn't want you there so much. So every behavior of the therapist causes a reaction in the family. So in that sense, joining is diagnosis. At the same time, every behavior of the therapist is either an accommodation or a resistance to the rules of that family. Now, and when we first go in, we don't always know what we're doing. We don't know when are we accommodating and when are we resisting or when are we challenging. But it's going on. In fact, sometimes we'll feel that we had this great first session and then we'll get a call saying they're not coming back. Well, we felt that we were accommodating well or sort of challenging at the right degree, and the family experienced us differently. And the family experiences good joining when they feel that the therapist understands them as individuals, understands the relationships between them, and is interested in their welfare. They hear someone who knows who we are and really wants to help. And that is the therapist's leverage for change. Okay. He talks about three kinds of joining. Close range, middle range, and far range. In close range joining, the therapist... Do I have that? Yes. In close range joining, the therapist accepts and supports each member of the system. And he finds something positive to say about them. One thing about Minuchin is he often found something positive to say about the symptom, that the symptomatic behavior of the patient, of the member of the family. For example, if a little kid in the family was making a real scene in a session, he would say, "That was a tremendous production." And at this stage, he's also very clear to be non-judgmental. He wants the members of the family will feel that they can tell them and him who they are and show him who they are, and he will accept them. In medium range joining, the therapist is a neutral listener. Either passively by sort of noticing what goes on, or actively through what we call circular questioning. Circular questions are questions that relate not so much to a person's inner experience, but relate to the interactiveness within the family. As the family will come in and tell the therapist about something terrible that has happened, he'll want to sort of track every step of the way that an incident developed within the family, how each person related to each other, how each person saw it. He wants to, and in this way, the therapist is, since teaching the family to look at themselves in an interactive way, where instead of sort of focusing on the identified patient as the person who is sort of housing the pathology within the family. Now, the third kind of joining, which we call enactment, which I think is also, I would call it the basic Minuchin intervention, is both a tool of diagnosis and a tool for creating change. And when we talk about an enactment, this is where the therapist becomes a kind of a director of the therapy and telling people what to do. He directs the interaction of the family members. The idea behind that is that family members often try to sort of maintain their good behavior in front of the therapist, but if he asks them to interact, then it's harder to do that, and that more of the basic structure comes to the surface. And the enactment transformed the therapy from an experience of talking about the problems to actually living them in the therapy room. There are three stages of an enactment. In the first stage, the therapist observes spontaneous interactions of the family and decides on which area of dysfunction he wants to focus. And this is the place where Minuchin does it in 5 minutes, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, and it could take us a little longer before we understand enough what's going on, and we try to intervene. The therapist organizes a situation in which the family will behave according to the dysfunctional rules. He tells them to interact, and he's pretty sure that they will interact in the way that is not working for them. And then the therapist suggests an alternative. Yeah.
These levels of joining are in order?
I was asked if the levels of joining are in order, to a certain extent, but to a certain extent not. First of all, the sort of close range joining is probably going to happen in every session. That's what every session will more or less start with. Because when we think about it, the enactment is really challenging the family. And in order for the family to accept that challenge from the therapist, they have to feel that their bond with him is being strengthened all the time. So I have an example here.
Question?
Yes.
When you talk about reenactment, you're talking about it's role playing. You kind of are put in the same situation.
I was asked if it's role play in the sense of being put into the same situation. Yes or no? In the sense that, yes, the therapist could say, oh, you're telling me about what happened at home, let's try to replay that here. But for Minuchin, it's more reacting to something that's happening in the session itself. Like he will note, in that sense, it's more directly connected to the process within the session. Like he will see something that's happening, he will identify it, and he'll say, okay, I would like to talk to the father. I say, talk to your son about that. Not about what happened at home, what happened just now. Okay. Okay, so just for an example here. This is really, it was taken from one of the Minuchin tapes that we had at Shivu. There's a divorced woman with 2 children. She had been a mental patient at the mental health center that this consultation was taking place, and she had 2 children. There was a very difficult story behind this family, and she walked into the consultation, and there were some chairs lined around, and Minuchin said, and he sort of says, well, you can sit down, and he picks up that that is not such an easy task for this family, because the little girl is saying, I want to sit here, and then she sits there, and then she says, no, I want to sit there, and so the mother tells the boy, get up, please make room for her sister, and he says, why do I have to do that? And this was going on. And that's where he says to the woman, tell your children where to sit. And she eventually does that. And he says to her, well, if it took so much to get to this, to get your children to sit down, you must be exhausted. And she says, tell me about it. And in that sense, the enactment is both a diagnosis, because you really see what happens between the mother and the children when this goes on, but it's also a way of building the sense of joining with his mother. And this is actually a case that I had many years ago. There was which is another kind of use of enactment. This was a mother. She was coming in with her 5 children after a difficult divorce. One of the boys was the IP, that he had all sorts of problems at school, but he was also very oppositional at home. And the other kids, I would try to find out what's going on with them, and I would always hear how everything is absolutely fine with them. And one time they came into the session, and she was very angry at the boy because he had caused a scene when she picked him up to bring them to therapy. And she was screaming at him, and she was saying these terrible, terrible things about him, but she was absolutely helpless. And this is a mother that when she first brought the kids in, and she was like a drill sergeant. I mean, I was very impressed how they all just sort of lined up and all sat down. But with this, in this case, that ability that she had was not being used. So, and of course, I felt terrible for the little boy. So what I sort of did was I sort of put my arm around him, and I said to her, he really did something bad. You have to find a way to punish him for this. And she said, he won't do anything that I tell him to do. And I just wouldn't, and I said, no, I want you to do that now. You have to punish your son. And then she said, and she eventually said to him, okay, when we get home, you're going to your room, you're going to think about what you did, and tomorrow you're going to you tell all the children who saw you misbehave that you're sorry that they had to see that. And he did it. He went home, they went home, he went into his room, he didn't make any problems, and he did it. And it was sort of a turning point within the therapy. And I really think of him, he was a little boy that he had problems of his own, but because of everything that had developed around him, no one was really telling him what to do. And his mother was able, in that enactment, to have an experience of telling her child what to do, and he was going, and he did it. And I think that would be an example of where the enactment brought about sort of a deeper change in the structure. I mean, it didn't just happen in those 15 minutes. There was part of the whole therapeutic process, but that was an intervention that it really helped. Okay. Now, the therapist family struggle. This is important, and you'll see in the tape that I brought, one of the first things that Minuchin says to his audience when they're watching his work is he's saying, the family is always wrong.
We don't have that.
Yeah, right. You don't have that. I put this in afterwards. Because I realize it's important. Yes?
What's to keep the family structure from going back?
Okay, the question is, what's to keep the family structure from going back? I think that's it's a very good question, because we often see how things go back. Now, according to the original theory, things don't go back because if the structure changes and the family is functioning better, that in of itself will perpetuate the change. That was a kind of 60s thing.
I'll buy it. So many patterns are so ingrained for such a long time.
Now, first of all, there's another aspect of this, and that is we're thinking about families and how rigid are they and how flexible are they. There are families that are more flexible and the families that are more rigid. A more flexible family will be able to absorb the change and the structure will change. If the family is more rigid, it's going to take in more work. I mean, one of the things that I didn't prepare is that Minuchin, he would talk about intensification of the process. In the sense that, which basically said, if the family doesn't hear the therapist, then the therapist has to learn to shout. And it means you need to have a more powerful intervention. But I think that maybe that doesn't really answer the question, because the question is though, like people were doing things in a certain way, and that pattern, that older pathological pattern, it's also part of the potential. Like people who, a family that develops a new way of doing something, it doesn't mean that they've forgotten that old way of doing things. And usually, or often, when the family is again under stress, and again in a transformational or a transition period, you will find the family goes back to the older patterns. I mean, it reminds me of one case that I had that where the husband and wife actually they made tremendous gains, and then they came back about a year later, and it was like they were right back where they were before. But it only took about 4 sessions to sort of help them get back to a better place. Which means that, I think what that meant was for this couple, so of course the old pattern, the old potential pattern was always there, but the new pattern also was available to them, and they were able to use that. Okay, so when we talk about the therapist-family struggle, to Minuchin, the therapy is not always a smooth conversation between a therapist and a cooperative family. It's more like a struggle. The family struggles to maintain its understanding of the system, and this understanding contributes to the pathological interactions which maintain the system. Like we have one way of looking at it, and you're coming in with a new way, but we're not accepting that so easily. And the therapist challenges both the understanding of the symptom and the pathological family structure. Now, there are 3 kinds of interventions that are often used by the therapist in this struggle. One is reframing, one is boundary making. Oh. Yeah, I guess I didn't. Where am I? Oh. Reframing, boundary making, and unbalancing. Okay. Reframing. One of the mechanisms by which the family maintains the homeostasis is the cognitive frame through which they perceive reality. In a dysfunctional family, their coping frame can limit their coping mechanisms, and for this reason, therapy often starts as a struggle between 2 frames of reality. The frame of the family acts to maintain the system and the symptom, and the frame of the therapist acts to induce change and a more effective form of coping. The family tends to define the problem as a function of individuals or outside forces, and the therapist defines the problem as a function of the family structure. Okay. So then there are 2 principles of reframing. One is to widen the focus from the identified patient to the entire system. And 2, to define everyone's motivation in positive terms. So the therapist is not going to say, you're being a bad mother for thinking about it that way. He's going to say, I really understand how you got there to think about this, but let's look at it a different way. Now, one of the very famous cases that is in his book on psychosomatic families, Minuchin, he did a lot of work with psychosomatic families, especially with anorectic, what he called anorectic families. They had a clinic where they took they had a special approach to this. They basically saw anorectic families as families that were very enmeshed and very focused on the somatic experience of the children, and that often had difficulty in allowing their children to grow up, and would see anorexia as the symptom that the anorectic girl or boy chose as a way of having some kind of control of him, on himself or herself. And so there's in this case, this was an Italian family, and sort of listening to the tape was always a challenge, because Minuchin was there talking in his heavy Spanish accent, and they were all talking in their heavy Italian accent. It was sort of hard to follow. But they came in, and the girl had been hospitalized for something else, for some kind of operation, and she basically came out having lost a lot of weight and was seriously anorectic. And the mother wrote to Minuchin asking if they could come and get some help. And what he saw was a family where the parents were very, very loving and very, very close to their children, but that the mother basically decided everything. And at one point he asked the girl, have you ever won an argument with your parents? And she looked at him and said, absolutely never. So how did he develop his reframing? He first talked about what a loving family they were. In fact, the parents, everybody in the family was convinced that the mother had psychic powers, so she always knew when something was wrong with one of the children, and he would say, wow, that's absolutely amazing. But his reframing was, this is a family that has been absolutely wonderful for small children, but there is a problem, because children need to be able to argue with their parents, and the parents sort of fought him on that. And so at one point he says that this family needs to learn to argue, because if she never wins an argument, she's going to die. And they developed a therapy afterwards in which there was a lot of arguments between the girl and her parents. There was also a lot of work done to help her gain some weight, and so they sort of got past that. So he could tell them that something has to change here after they felt that he really appreciated them. Okay. Boundary making. Dysfunctional family dynamics are developed from and sustained by overly rigid or diffuse boundaries. Structural therapists intervene to realign boundaries, increasing either proximity or distance between family members. So if we're talking about enmeshed families, family members are urged to talk for themselves. In that same tape of the mother with the two children, when he would talk to the son, the mother would always answer. And so he intervened there, and he said, no, I think, he sort of asked her, do you think he doesn't know what to say? He asked the boy if he knows what to say, and they sort of focused on that. And then he became a kind of traffic light for the mother. Like he would, and every time the mother would say something that he thought was intervening in his discussion with her son, he would say, red light, and she would say, okay, there I went, I talk too much, until the next time that she would say something, and he would say, okay, red light, and that's how they worked. And one of the important things is that in an enmeshed family, the therapist helps dyads, which means two members of the family, to have a conversation without anybody else intervening. In disengaged families, the therapist challenges conflict avoidance and blocks detouring and maintains safety and prevents escape. Recently I was working with a family where the son, who is in his 30s, has been really in a kind of cut-off from his parents for quite a number of years. And they decided they wanted family therapy, but he can come to therapy about beginning once every 3 months, then maybe every 2 months. We finally got it to every other week because there was so much anxiety about having the meetings. And after one meeting where actually he, at the end of the meeting, he said, wow, there's been a real breakthrough here because my parents have really understood me in a way they haven't understood before. But it's going to be hard these next couple months to come because I have this trip to Europe, and I think you should see my parents by yourself, and then I'll come back in a few months. And that was the place where I felt that I had to block the escape. I had to say, no, if you go out now, your parents are not going to want to come back. We have to find a way to do this. And so we've been working on that. But that's an example of a disengaged family in which the therapist needs to block the attempt of people to escape from dealing with things. Okay, we're okay with time. Now, the third intervention that I want to talk about with Minuchin is what he calls unbalancing. And the goal of unbalancing is to change the hierarchical relationships within the subsystems. Now, to begin with, when the therapist comes into the family, he's already started to change the hierarchical relationships within the family because he has taken a leadership role in the process. So things have already been shaken up a bit. And so that's a kind of basis for shaking things up a bit more. The members of the family usually expect the therapist to be firm but fair. And instead of that, the therapist joins an individual or subsystem and supports it at the expense of others. Now, this is something that sort of goes against the grain of a lot of what we've been taught as therapists. But I must say, I found it to be, and it's also not so PC today, but I found it to be actually very effective. The therapist joins with a family member who has a low standing in the family hierarchy, and he strengthens him or her and attacks another family member. As a result of this, the family member who had been in the lower hierarchical position changes his or her position vis-a-vis the family and doesn't react in the same way to the signals that the family has been giving him or her as to what position he or she should take. And he dares to try new ways of functioning within the family. And the change in the hierarchical position of the IP causes a change in the way that other family members relate to him. I think it's one of the places that I found this most effective is when you have couples where they're sort of defined as over-functioning and under-functioning, in which I come in to support the under-functioning member of the couple. I'll just give you an example. Okay. This was a couple that I work with. They were a couple in their 50s. They had a number of children. They had like five children, I think. They were sort of like good members of the community. She came from a very solid, sort of almost like Israeli aristocratic background. Like her family was very well known, and she went back a long time. And he came from overseas, from not such a great family background. And originally she had sort of was attracted to him because he was different than everything that she sort of knew. And he was attracted to her because she offered a kind of stability that he hadn't had in his life. And they made a life together, and they were both in respectable professions. But as time went by, he became more and more sort of morose. He would spend more time in his room, and he started taking trips overseas to Thailand, to India, to different places. And like he would ask her to come with him, but she never wanted to go. She had a kind of principle about not leaving the land of Israel. She and on the surface, like everything she said was also always completely right. Like when it had to do with the children, whatever she had to say really made sense. He had some like more problems with some of the children. As far as like their plans for the future, it was all very well thought out. And the more this went on, the more sort of a little bit weird he became. And they came into therapy, and things are sort of going on okay, but nothing was really changing until I decided to take a more unbalancing stand, and I started to talk to her about her rigidity. And this was kind of new for her, but I think to her credit, she thought about it. And the more that she thought about her rigidity and sort of connected it to where it came from, she started to be a little more open to the kind of things that he was suggesting for their relationship. And he started to become a little less weird. Like he started to act like a more outstanding citizen that he was supposed to be. And something changed there. But I think it really changed. What the therapy did was to sort of unhinge the balance where it had been, and to sort of offer them the possibility of developing something else and something new for the relationship. Okay, I'm doing okay. Yes, I'd like to say, take maybe 3 questions that I want to show you. I want to show you a film of Minuchin himself working. Yes.
If one takes like one of the spouses and like really gets to them, let's say, you also go into the risk of losing them.
Always.
Because
Okay. The question was if you unbalance and you support one of the spouses, then the other, you can lose the couple because the other couple isn't going to want to come back. And I think it's a good question. You need to always be working on your joining with that couple, either with the other, like the hierarchical spouse, in order for that spouse also has to feel that if you're doing it, you're really doing it for him or her as well. Like if you have,
1 week this one week that.
not necessarily. Sometimes, but that's not really unbalancing. If you're unbalancing for a while to make a change. But hopefully you have the kind of initial joining with that couple, so that even if one of the spouses is feeling uncomfortable, he or she will still go with you. Now in this particular case, I think much to her credit, when I started talking about her rigidity, she started taking a look at that. And it really opened up something, I think, for her personally as well. But Minuchin will also talk about this in the tape that I'm going to show you.
Would you say in your experience, though, that you lost some couples in this process?
Well, I've lost couples a lot along the way, but not any more than in general in therapy, I don't think. Okay. Any other? Okay, so let's run the movie. First of all, when he's doing that, he's also diagnosing. Like he's seeing their reaction. He hasn't decided yet to really push that kind of enactment, but he sees how they react when he asks them to do that task. They pull back. And he hasn't decided that he's going to push that as much as he... Also because I think it's a very, very early stage of the therapy, the session, so he's more getting a feel for the family and not trying to make an enactment that's going to end a change. And you asked if there was a happy ending to this story. What happened is afterwards he does meet with the parents by themselves, which is something that he writes about in that book, which was a kind of development of his work. And he finds out, basically he wants to talk to the parents after he has identified the dysfunctional pattern that they're in. He wants to ask them, how is it that, what happened in your life that brought you to develop that kind of pattern? And he hears from the mother, both about her own difficult childhood, and especially about the circumstances of the daughter's birth and the daughter's childhood, and how many times the daughter was in terrible danger, and how she had to rescue her, and how basically why she is so afraid that something is going to happen to her. And so once that element comes in, he can first of all be understanding of it and help them see how this has been so influential in the way they've developed, and that opens up the possibility of change. Okay? Anything else? Okay, well, thank you very much.